On the evening of July 19, 2016, in the rural farmland of Fulton County, Ohio, a 20-year-old college student pedaled her new purple bicycle down County Road 6 and never arrived home. What began as a 7-minute ride through cornfields would ignite a search that spanned 3 states, uncovered a property designed for captivity, and exposed a question that still haunts investigators today. How many others were there? This is the story of Sierra Juffin, a case that changed Ohio law and revealed how a man convicted of violent abduction could vanish into the countryside for 26 years. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Metamora, Ohio is the kind of place you might drive through without noticing. Population less than 600. No stoplights. Just stretches of 2-lane roads cutting through soybean and corn. Farmhouses set back a quarter-mile from the pavement, and the kind of quiet that city people find unnerving. The village sits in Fulton County, northwest Ohio, near the Michigan and Indiana borders, where the land is flat and the horizon goes on forever. In summer, the corn grows taller than a person, walls of green rustling in the wind, and once you step off the road, you disappear. It's a farming community, tight-knit in the way small towns are, where everyone knows everyone. And the worst crime in recent memory was usually a stolen tractor or teenagers tipping mailboxes. For families like the Juffins, it was home, safe, peaceful. The kind of place where you didn't lock your doors, where kids rode bikes until dark, and where the biggest worry was whether it would rain before harvest. Sierra Juffin was 20 years old in the summer of 2016, a junior at the University of Toledo's College of Business, studying to build a career in marketing or entrepreneurship. She lived with her mother, Sheila Hagan, and her 4 younger siblings in a modest house just outside Metamora's center. Sheila, a single mother, worked long hours to support the family, and Sierra, as the eldest, had taken on the role of second parent, helping with homework, driving her siblings to school, making sure everyone ate dinner. She was the glue, Sheila would later say, the one who kept us all together. Those who knew Sierra described her in a way that felt almost too perfect, until you met people who actually knew her and realized it wasn't exaggeration. She was loud, funny, unapologetically herself. She loved to make people laugh, often at her own expense, and had a gift for putting strangers at ease within minutes of meeting them. Her aunt, Tara, remembered that Sierra could walk into a room full of people she'd never met and leave with 5 new friends. She didn't wait for permission to be noticed. She just was. Sierra had been with her boyfriend, Josh Kolasinski, since they were 13, a relationship that had started in middle school and grown into something steady and serious. By 2016, they were already talking about marriage after graduation, about traveling, about building a life together. Josh described her as fiercely independent, confident to the point where you couldn't really argue with her because she'd already thought 3 steps ahead. She didn't need rescuing. She didn't need reassurance. She knew who she was. On that Tuesday in July, the weather was warm, low 80s, with clear skies and a light breeze. Sierra had spent the afternoon at Josh's house, a few miles outside Metamora, and around 6:30 in the evening, the two decided to go for a bike ride. Sierra had just gotten a new purple bicycle, a gift she was proud of, and she wanted to test it out before the sun set. The plan was simple. They'd ride together partway, then Sierra would finish the last stretch home alone. It was a route they'd taken dozens of times before, a quiet country road with almost no traffic, bordered on both sides by cornfields. Josh later told investigators that they rode side by side, talking about the future, about classes starting up again in the fall, about plans for the weekend. At 6:43 p.m., he posted 2 short videos to Snapchat showing them riding together, Sierra's purple bike visible in the frame, her neon tank top bright against the green fields. The videos were casual, unremarkable, the kind of thing people post without thinking. In less than 2 hours, they would become evidence. Around 7 p.m., they reached the point where Josh usually turned back, a fork in the road about 1.5 miles from Sierra's house. She told him she'd be fine finishing the rest alone, that he didn't need to worry, that she'd text him when she got home. Josh hesitated. He later said he didn't want to leave her, that something felt off, though he couldn't say what. But Sierra insisted. She was independent like that, didn't like being fussed over. So he stopped, and they said goodbye, hugs and kisses, and she told him again, "I'll text you." He stood there watching as she pedaled away, her bike disappearing down County Road 6, swallowed by the corridor of corn. That was the last time anyone who loved her saw Sierra Juffin alive. When Josh arrived home around 7:15, he waited for her text. 15 minutes passed, then 30. He sent her a message. No response. He called. It went straight to voicemail. At first, he assumed her phone had died, that she'd forgotten to charge it, that she'd gotten distracted at home and would call him back soon. But as the minutes became an hour, a knot of worry began to tighten in his chest. He called again. Voicemail. He called Sheila. Sheila wasn't home. She'd been out running errands, and when Josh reached her, she assumed Sierra was either already home or still with him. There was a brief, confusing exchange, each thinking the other had seen her last, and then the realization hit them both at once. No one knew where Sierra was. Sheila rushed home. Sierra's bike wasn't there. Her phone was off. Sheila and Josh drove the route Sierra would have taken, calling her name out the windows, scanning the ditches and cornfields for any sign of her. Nothing. The sun was setting, the light fading fast, and the corn was so tall and dense that you couldn't see more than a few feet into the fields. If she'd fallen, if she'd been hurt, they wouldn't be able to find her by car. By 9 p.m., they contacted the Fulton County Sheriff's Office. A missing persons report was filed at 11 p.m., and by 3 a.m. search teams were deployed. Police brought in K9 units, helicopters equipped with infrared cameras, and volunteers from surrounding towns who fanned out across the countryside with flashlights, moving methodically through the cornfields. The temperature had dropped into the 60s, the air cool and damp, and the darkness was absolute. The search area was enormous, thousands of acres of farmland crisscrossed by gravel roads and drainage ditches, and the assumption at that point was still that Sierra had been in an accident, that she'd swerved to avoid an animal, gone into a ditch, hit her head. No one was saying the word abduction yet, but that changed at 3:30 a.m. A deputy walking the shoulder of County Road 6, about a quarter mile from Sierra's house, spotted something glinting in the beam of his flashlight. It was Sierra's purple bike, lying on its side in the gravel, partially hidden in the tall grass near the edge of a cornfield. The bike was intact, no visible damage, the tires still inflated. But Sierra wasn't there. Nearby, investigators found items that didn't belong to her: a small fuse box, 2 pairs of sunglasses, a screwdriver, and what appeared to be motorcycle tire tracks in the dirt. There were also broken corn stalks, bent and snapped, with dark stains that field tests would later confirm as blood. The scene suggested a struggle, something violent, something sudden. Sierra's home was less than 500 feet away. She had been so close. At dawn, the FBI was brought in, and the area was sealed off as a crime scene. Special Agent Kevin Cornelius, who led the federal investigation, would later describe the feeling at the scene as deeply unsettling. The kind of quiet that presses in on you, the unmistakable sense that something terrible had happened here and that the clock was ticking. Because if Sierra had been taken, if someone had forced her into a vehicle, she could already be hundreds of miles away. And in cases like this, the first 24 hours are everything. Josh Kolosinski was questioned first, a standard procedure given that he was the last known person to see Sierra alive. Investigators asked about their relationship, about the ride, about whether they'd argued, whether there were problems. Josh was cooperative, devastated, and visibly shaken. He provided his phone, showed them the Snapchat videos, gave them access to his messages. He also had a solid alibi, confirmed by neighbors who saw him arrive home around 7:15, and by phone records showing he'd been trying to reach Sierra repeatedly starting around 7:30. Within hours, he was cleared. Investigators then turned to technology. Sierra had been wearing a Fitbit fitness tracker, which logged her heart rate and movement. Data from the device showed that her heart rate spiked sharply around 7:15 p.m., then flatlined minutes later, suggesting either that the device had been removed or that she had suffered a medical event. Her cell phone, an iPhone, had pinged a tower several miles to the west around 7:20 p.m., but then went offline and never reconnected. Technicians attempted to triangulate the location, but the rural area had limited cell coverage, and the ping was too broad to pinpoint an exact spot. What it told them was that Sierra, or at least her phone, had been moved west, away from her home, in the minutes after she disappeared. One theory that emerged early was human trafficking. Investigators knew that rural highways in Ohio and neighboring states had become corridors for trafficking networks, and there had been cases in the past where young women were abducted from isolated areas and transported across state lines. The FBI opened lines of communication with trafficking task forces in Michigan, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, checking for reports of women matching Sierra's description. But as the hours passed, that theory began to feel less likely. Trafficking abductions, while they do happen, are usually opportunistic, targeting women in vulnerable situations at truck stops, rest areas, places where the victim is alone and transient. Sierra had been on a bike, in broad daylight, on a road she knew, within sight of her own house. This felt different. This felt targeted. On the second day, investigators re-examined the items found near Sierra's bike. The fuse box, sunglasses, and screwdriver were sent to the state crime lab for fingerprint and DNA analysis. The motorcycle tracks were photographed and measured, the tread pattern catalogued. Detectives began canvassing the area, knocking on doors, asking residents if they'd seen anything unusual, any vehicles, any strangers. Most people hadn't seen anything. The road was quiet, especially in the evenings, but one farmer mentioned that he'd heard a motorcycle around 7 p.m. heading west, though he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Another resident recalled seeing a white van parked on a side road earlier that day, but couldn't remember details. These were fragments, pieces that didn't yet fit together, but investigators logged everything. Meanwhile, Sierra's family was falling apart. Sheila, her mother, organized search parties, printed flyers, posted to social media, begging anyone with information to come forward. Josh couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, replaying the moment he'd let her ride home alone over and over in his mind. Sierra's siblings, the youngest, just 7 years old, didn't fully understand what was happening, only that their big sister was gone, and no one could tell them when she'd be back. The community rallied, as small towns do. Volunteers searched fields, businesses donated food and supplies, churches held vigils. But beneath the hope and solidarity, there was a growing, unspoken dread. Because as each day passed without a lead, without a sighting, the likelihood that Sierra was still alive diminished. On the third day, July 22nd, a detective named Lieutenant Sean Schulte, who had been reviewing old case files, came across a name: James Worley. Worley was a 57-year-old man who lived on a property about 3 miles from where Sierra's bike had been found. He was a registered violent offender, convicted in 1990 of abduction and attempted rape after he'd kidnapped a 26-year-old woman named Robin Gardner at knife point, driven her to a remote barn, and tried to sexually assault her. Gardner had escaped, and Worley had served only 3 years in prison before being released. When Schulte saw that Worley lived so close to the crime scene, owned a motorcycle, and had a history of violent abduction, he immediately flagged the name. The problem was that in 2016, Ohio did not have a centralized, accessible database of violent offenders that local law enforcement could quickly search in the critical first hours of a missing person case. Worley's name was in the system, but buried, and it took 3 days for investigators to connect the dots. By the time they did, Sierra had been missing for 72 hours. On the morning of July 22nd, detectives drove out to Worley's property, a 10-acre plot of farmland on Mulberry Road in Delta, Ohio, a tiny unincorporated community even more remote than Metamora. The property was overgrown, isolated, surrounded by fields and woods, accessible only by a long gravel driveway. There was a house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Worley's white van was parked near the barn. When officers approached, Worley came out to meet them. He was tall, thin, with graying hair and a calm, almost detached demeanor. Detectives identified themselves and asked if they could ask him a few questions. Worley agreed, standing in the driveway with his arms crossed, relaxed. They asked where he'd been on Tuesday evening, July 19th. Worley said he'd been home, working on his property, hadn't gone anywhere. He said he'd heard about the missing girl on the news, terrible thing, hoped they'd find her. His tone was cooperative, his answers smooth. But then one of the detectives asked if they could take a look around the property, just to rule him out. Worley hesitated. He said he'd prefer if they didn't, that he valued his privacy. The detective pressed, said it would only take a few minutes, that it would help them eliminate him as a suspect. Worley refused. He said if they wanted to search, they'd need a warrant. That refusal was a red flag. Within hours, investigators obtained a search warrant, and by early afternoon, a team of officers returned to Worley's property with K9 units and forensic technicians. What they found inside the barn would turn the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide. The barn was old, its exterior weathered and unremarkable, the kind of structure you'd see on 100 farms in rural Ohio. But inside it had been modified. There was a hidden room accessible through a false wall, about 10 feet by 12 feet with no windows. The floor was concrete. The walls were lined with soundproofing material. There were restraints bolted into the walls, a mattress on the floor, and a collection of items that included rope, duct tape, knives, and a taser. In one corner, investigators found a freezer. They opened it. Inside, wrapped in a tarp and trash bags, was Sierra Juffin's body. She had been stabbed multiple times. Her clothes, the neon tank top and shorts she'd been wearing, were still on her, though torn. Her Fitbit was missing. Her phone was found later, discarded in a field about a mile from Worley's property. The SIM card removed. The barn, the freezer, the hidden room, it was clear that this space had been designed for exactly this purpose: abduction, captivity, murder. James Worley was arrested on the spot, charged initially with abduction, and within days after autopsy results confirmed the cause of death, upgraded to aggravated murder. He did not resist arrest. He did not ask for a lawyer immediately. He sat in the back of a patrol car, silent, staring out the window, and when detectives asked him if he wanted to explain what had happened, he said nothing. The discovery of Sierra's body answered one question and opened a dozen more. The autopsy conducted by the Lucas County Coroner's Office revealed that Sierra had been stabbed multiple times in the torso and neck, wounds consistent with a prolonged violent attack. She had also suffered blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner estimated that she had died within hours of her abduction, likely late on the night of July 19th or early morning on July 20th. There was evidence of a struggle, defensive wounds on her hands and arms, suggesting she had fought back. DNA evidence was collected from beneath her fingernails, some of it matching Worley, but some of it unidentified, a detail that would become significant during the trial. The forensic team spent days processing Worley's property. They found bloodstains in the barn that matched Sierra's DNA. They found fibers from her clothing on the floor of the hidden room. They also found items that didn't belong to Sierra, items that suggested other women may have been held there in the past. A hairbrush with long blonde hair, not Sierra's. A pair of women's shoes, size 7, worn and old. A bracelet. Investigators photographed and catalogued everything, and the question that no one wanted to ask out loud but everyone was thinking became impossible to ignore. Had James Worley done this before? To answer that, investigators had to go back to 1990. Robin Gardner was 26 years old in May of that year, a resident of Fulton County, working as a waitress and trying to save money for nursing school. On the afternoon of May 5th, 1990, she was riding her bicycle along a rural road near her home when a man in a white van pulled up beside her. The man, later identified as James Worley, told her his motorcycle had broken down and asked if she could give him a ride to retrieve tools from his barn. Gardner, wanting to help, agreed. But once she was in the van, Worley pulled a knife, held it to her throat, and drove her to his property. He took her into the barn, tied her up, and attempted to sexually assault her. Gardner fought back, managed to break free, and escaped through a window, running barefoot through the fields until she reached a neighbor's house. Police were called. Worley was arrested, and he was charged with abduction, attempted rape, and assault. The case went to trial, and Worley was convicted. But because of plea negotiations and sentencing guidelines at the time, he served only 3 years in prison, released in 1993. Robin Gardner's testimony during Worley's 1990 trial was detailed and harrowing. She described the barn, the restraints, the way Worley had seemed calm, almost methodical, as if he'd done this before. She described his van, the way he'd lured her in with a story about needing help. And she described the hidden room in the barn, the same room that investigators would find again, 26 years later, almost unchanged. After his release in 1993, Worley returned to his property in Delta. He was required to register as a violent offender, but the laws at the time were not what they are today. There was no public database, no community notification, no electronic monitoring. He was required to check in with a parole officer periodically, but beyond that, he was free to live his life. And so he did. For over 2 decades, James Worley lived on his property, alone, rarely seen in town, keeping to himself. Neighbors described him as odd, quiet, sometimes rude. There were occasional complaints about his property being an eyesore, about junk piling up, about dogs barking at night. But nothing that rose to the level of criminal investigation. He worked odd jobs, mostly in construction or farm labor, paid his bills, and stayed off law enforcement's radar. Until July 19, 2016. During the investigation into Sierra's murder, detectives interviewed Worley's family members, neighbors, and acquaintances, trying to build a profile of the man. What emerged was a picture of someone deeply isolated, someone who had few close relationships, who was suspicious of outsiders, and who seemed to have a long-standing obsession with control and domination. His sister, who had been estranged from him for years, told investigators that she had always believed James was involved in other disappearances, though she had no proof. She mentioned the names of 3 women who had gone missing in the region over the past 30 years, cases that had never been solved. One of those names was Claudia Tinsley, a 21-year-old woman who disappeared in 1981 after being seen at a bar in Toledo. Worley had admitted to being with her that night, but claimed he dropped her off and never saw her again. Her body was never found. Another name was Lori Ann Hill, a 14-year-old girl who vanished in 1982 while riding her bike near her home. The similarities to Sierra's case were chilling. Lori's bike had been found abandoned on a rural road, but Lori herself was never seen again. At the time, there were no leads, no suspects, and the case went cold. Investigators in 2016 reopened both cases, comparing evidence, looking for connections. But without physical evidence linking Worley to these disappearances, they could not bring charges. The question remains open. How many others were there? Worley's trial began in April 2018, nearly 2 years after Sierra's murder. The prosecution, led by Fulton County Assistant Prosecuting Attorney Scott Hazelman, presented a methodical, evidence-driven case. They showed the jury crime scene photos, forensic reports, phone records, and surveillance footage from a gas station, showing Worley's van in the area on the afternoon of July 19th. They called Robin Gardner to the stand, and her testimony was devastating. She described in painstaking detail the barn, the van, the knife, and the way Worley had tried to control her. She told the jury that when she heard Sierra's case on the news, she knew immediately who had taken her. The defense, led by court-appointed attorneys, had little to work with. They did not dispute that Sierra had been found in Worley's barn, or that Worley had a violent criminal history. Instead, they tried to argue that the evidence did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Worley had personally killed Sierra, suggesting that the unidentified DNA found under her fingernails could indicate the presence of another person. They also attempted to portray Worley as mentally ill, presenting testimony from a psychologist who diagnosed him with sexual paraphilia disorder and described him as someone who had been shaped by severe childhood trauma, including alleged abuse. The prosecution countered that mental illness did not excuse premeditated murder, and that the evidence, taken as a whole, pointed to one conclusion. James Worley had abducted Sierra Juffin, held her in his barn, and killed her. They pointed to the items found at the crime scene, the motorcycle tracks, the timeline, and the forensic evidence. They pointed to the freezer, the hidden room, the restraints. They argued that this was not a crime of passion, not an accident, but a calculated act of violence by a man who had done this before and would have done it again if he hadn't been caught. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On May 25, 2018, they returned a verdict. Guilty on 17 of 19 charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. The defense argued for life in prison without parole. The prosecution sought the death penalty. During the sentencing phase, Worley addressed the court for the first time, speaking for nearly 40 minutes. He denied killing Sierra, claimed he had been framed, and at one point made a statement so disturbing that Sierra's family left the courtroom. He said, and this is a direct quote from court transcripts, "Don't ask me why she wasn't raped. Despite being a pretty girl, she wasn't." The courtroom went silent. Even the judge paused before instructing the bailiff to remove Worley if he continued. The jury recommended the death penalty. The judge agreed. On June 1, 2018, James Worley was sentenced to death by lethal injection, with an execution date initially set for March 2019. That date was later postponed due to appeals, and as of this recording, Worley remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution, awaiting a new execution date. In the months after the trial, Sheila Hagan filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Worley and was awarded $3.6 million in damages, as well as ownership of his property. She said publicly that she knew she would never see a cent of the money, but that wasn't the point. The point was that the property, the place where her daughter had died, would no longer belong to him. In 2019, Sheila organized the demolition of Worley's barn and house, an event attended by dozens of community members. The structures were torn down, burned, and the land cleared. Sheila said it felt like cleansing, like taking back something that had been poisoned. She plans to convert the land into a memorial park dedicated to Sierra, a place of light instead of darkness. In December 2018, Ohio Governor John Kasich signed Senate Bill 231, known as Sierra's Law, into law. The legislation, which passed unanimously in both chambers of the state legislature, established a publicly accessible database of violent offenders in Ohio, allowing law enforcement and citizens to quickly identify individuals with histories of violent crime living in their communities. The law also requires law enforcement to contact known violent offenders within the first 24 to 48 hours after a person is reported missing in their area, closing the gap that had delayed the investigation into Worley. By 2021, the database contained over 2,000 registered offenders. Advocates credit Sierra's law with preventing further tragedies, though they acknowledge that no law can eliminate risk entirely. The case of Sierra Juffin also reignited conversations about sentencing reform, about the fact that James Worley, a man convicted of violent abduction and attempted rape, had served only 3 years in prison before being released. Legal experts pointed out that Ohio's sentencing guidelines in the early 90s were considerably more lenient than they are today, and that under current law, a similar crime would carry a much longer sentence. But the broader question remains: how do we balance punishment, rehabilitation, and public safety in a way that prevents cases like this? There is no easy answer. Sierra's hometown of Metamora continues to honor her memory. At Evergreen High School, where she attended classes, a memorial tree and plaque were installed in her name, and an annual scholarship is awarded to a graduating senior who embodies Sierra's spirit of kindness and determination. Her family established a non-profit organization called Justice for Sierra, which provides self-defense training and safety education in schools across Ohio. Josh Kolosinski, Sierra's boyfriend, founded another organization called Keeping Our Girls Safe, which partners with first responders to teach young people how to recognize danger and seek help. Every year, the community holds the Sierra Juffin Memorial Motorcycle Ride, a 40-mile route through the countryside, attended by hundreds of bikers from across the state. There is also a 5-kilometer run called Jogging for Juffin, which raises money for the scholarship fund and safety programs. These events are not just about remembering Sierra. They are about making sure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else. Investigators continue to search for connections between Worley and other unsolved cases. In 2019, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation announced that they were re-examining evidence from several cold cases dating back to the 1980s. looking for DNA or other forensic links to Worley. As of now, no charges have been filed, but the investigations remain open. Robin Gardner, the woman who survived Worley's attack in 1990, has spoken publicly about the case, saying that she believes Worley did not stop offending after he was released from prison in 1993. She pointed out that it doesn't make sense, psychologically or behaviorally, for someone with his history to commit a violent crime, stop for decades, and then start again. Law enforcement officials agree. They believe that Worley's property, with its hidden room and restraints, was not built for a single crime, but for repeated use. The barn had been modified years before Sierra's abduction. The restraints were old, rusted. The soundproofing had been in place for a long time. These were not improvisations. They were preparations. Which leads to the question that investigators still ask themselves: how many women were held in that barn? And of those who were held, how many survived? The answer for now remains unknown. What is known is that Sierra Juffin's life was cut short in a way that no one should have to endure. She was 20 years old, a student, a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone with dreams and plans and a future ahead of her. She went for a bike ride on a summer evening and never came home. And in the wake of her death, her family and community have worked to make sure that her name means more than tragedy, that it means change, that it means safety, that it means hope. Sheila Hagan has said that Sierra's life was worth more than the 20 years she was given, that even in death, Sierra has inspired people she never met. She said, "I can't help but wonder what incredible things she might have accomplished if she was still here. But I know she's moving mountains even in death." The case of Sierra Juffin is a reminder that true crime is not entertainment, not fiction, not something distant that happens to other people. It is real, it is devastating, and it is a call to action, to be vigilant, to support victims, to demand better laws and better systems, and to remember that behind every case there is a person, a family, a community that will never be the same.